The scent of rotting vegetables and sun-baked leather filled Clara's nostrils as her fingers worked through the pile of discarded items behind Henderson's general store, searching desperately for any scrap of fabric that might still hold together long enough to patch the holes in her only remaining dress. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1882, and at 22 years old, Clara Hartwell had learned that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her father's death 3 months prior had left her with nothing but debts, and a one-room shack on the edge of town that barely kept the wind out. The seamstress shop her mother had run before succumbing to fever 2 years earlier had been sold to pay for the funeral, and Clara found herself with skills but no materials, hunger but no means. She pulled a torn piece of calico from beneath a broken crate, examining it with the critical eye her mother had taught her. The pattern was faded, but the weave was still tight in places. It would do for something. "You planning on making a dress out of garbage, miss?" Clara spun around, clutching the fabric to her chest, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The man standing at the corner of the building was tall, with shoulders that stretched the fabric of his dusty work shirt and a hat pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. His voice had been curious rather than mocking, but shame flooded through her nonetheless. "I'm planning on minding my own business," she said sharply, lifting her chin despite the threadbare state of her gray dress and the dirt smudging her hands. "I suggest you do the same." The cowboy stepped forward into the light, and she could see him more clearly now. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a roguish appearance that might have been threatening if not for the genuine concern in his expression. "I meant no offense," he said quietly, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that fell across his forehead. "Just seemed like maybe you could use something better than trash." "I can manage just fine on my own," Clara said, though her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough for both of them to hear. She wanted to disappear into the ground. The cowboy's expression softened further. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, holding it out to her. "Then maybe you can manage with this." Pride warred with necessity in Clara's chest. She stared at the coin, at the way the sunlight caught on its surface, and felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't take charity." "It's not charity. Consider it payment." He gestured to the scrap of fabric in her hands. "You're a seamstress, aren't you? I've got 3 shirts that need mending and nobody in this town who can make a stitch worth a damn. You fix them up for me and we'll call it an even trade." Clara studied his face, searching for any hint of pity or condescension. She found only honesty. "You don't even know if I can sew." "Your mother was Elizabeth Hartwell. She made the shirt I wore to my brother's wedding 5 years back, and it's still the finest thing I own." Figure the daughter learned something from a woman like that. He pressed the coin into her palm before she could protest further. "Name's James Sullivan. I work the ranch about 4 miles west of here. I'll bring those shirts by your place tomorrow if that suits you." Before Clara could respond, he had settled his hat back on his head, tipped it to her in a gesture of respect, and walked away, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. She stood frozen behind the general store, holding both the salvaged scrap and the silver dollar, her heart beating in a confused rhythm she couldn't quite name. That evening, Clara used half the silver dollar to buy beans and a small piece of salt pork from Henderson's. The shopkeeper, a portly man with permanently suspicious eyes, had looked at her payment as though checking for forgery. But the coin was good, and he grudgingly handed over her purchases. She carried them home in her apron, taking the long way around the edge of town to avoid the main street where the saloon girls stood in their bright dresses, and the ranch hands whooped and hollered on their way to spend their wages. Her shack sat alone on a patch of scrubland, its wooden walls gray with age and weather. Her father had won it in a card game years ago, back when his luck still held more often than it failed. Now it was all she had, and she kept it as clean as possible despite the gaps in the walls and the roof that leaked in 3 places when it rained. She had a table her father made, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a trunk that held her mother's sewing kit, and the few pieces of fabric left from the shop's inventory. Clara cooked her beans slowly over the small fire in her stove, making them last, adding just enough of the salt pork for flavor. She ate directly from the pot to save washing an extra dish, then used the remaining daylight to examine the scrap of calico she had found. By candlelight, she carefully cut around the worst stains and tears, salvaging what she could. Her hands moved with the practiced precision her mother had drilled into her from the time she was 7 years old, and for a moment she felt her mother's presence so strongly it was almost like she was still alive, still sitting in the chair across the table, humming while she worked. Sleep came slowly that night. Clara lay in her bed, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance and thinking about storm-colored eyes and a voice that held no judgment. James Sullivan. She turned the name over in her mind, remembering him vaguely from years past. His family owned one of the smaller ranches in the area, respectable but not wealthy. His brother had married Sarah Chen, the daughter of the man who ran the livery, and it had been the talk of the town for months because Sarah was Chinese and there were those who thought the mixing wrong. But the Sullivans had held their heads high and invited the whole town to the wedding anyway, and those who came had to admit it was a beautiful affair. She wondered if James's offer had been genuine or simply a kind way to give her charity without wounding her pride further. Either way, she would do the work if he brought the shirts. She would do it better than anyone else in the territory could, and she would prove that she was worth more than digging through trash. The next morning brought clouds that promised rain but never delivered. Clara woke early, as she always did, and used a precious cup of water to wash her face and hands. She had just finished braiding her dark hair when she heard the sound of horse hooves approaching. Her heart jumped inexplicably, and she smoothed down her dress before opening the door. James Sullivan sat astride a bay gelding, a bundle wrapped in brown paper balanced on his saddle. He dismounted with easy grace and walked toward her, his expression serious in the morning light. "Miss Hartwell," he said, tipping his hat. "Brought those shirts I mentioned." Clara stepped out onto the narrow porch, such as it was, really just a few boards that kept the dirt from coming right up to her door. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come. I'm a man of my word." He held out the bundle, and when she took it, their fingers brushed briefly. The contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. "There's no rush on them, whenever you have time." She unwrapped the paper enough to see inside, 3 shirts as promised, all needing various repairs, but beneath them was something else. She pulled back more of the paper and froze. Fabric. New fabric. 3 full yards of deep blue cotton and 2 yards of cream-colored muslin, the kind she hadn't been able to afford since before her mother died. "What is this?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended, defensive. "Thought you might need it for the repairs," James said, but his eyes shifted slightly, and she knew he was lying. "These shirts need thread and patches, not new fabric. This is worth more than you'd pay any seamstress for simple mending." She tried to shove the bundle back at him, anger and humiliation burning in her throat. "I told you I don't take charity. And I told you I need shirts mended." His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. "If you want to use some of that fabric for yourself after you're done with my work, I can't stop you. But the deal is for the mending, nothing more and nothing less." They stood facing each other, the bundle between them like a barrier. Clara could feel tears threatening again, and she hated herself for it. She was so tired of crying, so tired of being hungry and desperate and alone. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. James was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching her face. "Because 3 months ago, when my brother's wife had their baby, your mother's sewing kit was one of the only things that brought Sarah comfort. She said your mother had taught her how to make clothes for the baby, had treated her with kindness when others in this town treated her like dirt. And because when I heard Thomas Hartwell died and left his daughter with nothing, I thought about how my own mother would have wanted someone to help if I'd been in that position." He paused. "And because no person should have to pick through trash to survive. Not in this town, not anywhere." The tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down Clara's cheeks before she could stop them. She clutched the bundle to her chest and turned away, not wanting him to see her break. She heard him take a step closer, then stop, as if uncertain whether comfort would be welcome. "I'll have them done in 3 days," she managed to say, her voice thick. "That's fine. I'll come by to check on you, on them, on the shirts, I mean." He sounded flustered now, and despite everything, Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. "You do that, Mr. Sullivan." She heard him mount his horse, heard the creak of leather and the jingle of the bridle. "It's James," he called out. "Mr. Sullivan was my father." Clara waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before she went back inside. She laid the bundle on her table and carefully unwrapped it, running her hands over the fabric. It was good quality, the kind that would wear well and hold dye beautifully. The blue was the color of evening sky, and the cream was soft and smooth beneath her fingers. She allowed herself 5 minutes to simply touch it, to imagine what she could make, before she forced herself to focus on the shirts. James had been truthful about them needing mending. One had lost several buttons and had a torn seam along the shoulder. Another had a rip in the elbow that would need a patch. The third was missing a collar button and had fraying cuffs. Clara set to work immediately, pulling out her mother's sewing kit and selecting the right thread. Her hands moved with practiced skill, her stitches small and even, invisible when she wanted them to be, or decorative when she thought it might add to the appearance. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only to drink water and eat a small portion of the beans she had saved from the night before. The physical act of sewing soothed her, the repetitive motion quieting the anxious thoughts that usually circled her mind like vultures. By the time the sun began to set, she had finished 2 of the shirts and was halfway through the third. That night, she used a portion of the blue fabric to begin cutting out pieces for a new dress. She took her measurements by memory and feel, laying out the pattern in her mind before committing scissors to clothe. Each cut was decisive and sure. Her mother had taught her never to waste fabric, and Clara had learned the lesson well. By the time she went to bed, she had the main pieces cut and ready to sew, and her heart felt lighter than it had in months. The following morning brought James Sullivan back to her door, but this time he carried no bundle. Instead, he held his hat in his hands and wore an expression that seemed almost nervous. "Morning, Miss Hartwell," he said when she answered his knock. "I was heading into town and thought I'd check if you needed anything from the general store." Clara blinked in surprise. "I have everything I need for your shirts, thank you." "Right, yes, good." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "What about food or lamp oil, anything else, Mr. Sullivan, James?" She stepped out onto the porch, folding her arms across her chest. "Are you making a habit of checking on me now?" His ears turned red. "I just thought since I was going that way anyway, it wouldn't hurt to ask. And if I said yes, if I needed something, would you expect me to pay you back somehow?" She kept her voice even, but there was an edge to it. She needed to know his intentions, needed to understand what he wanted from her. James met her eyes directly. "I'd expect you to let me help a neighbor without assuming the worst of me. We're not neighbors. You live 4 miles away on a ranch. I live in a shack on scrubland. We're not the same." The words came out harsher than she intended, but she was so used to defending herself, to expecting the worst from people who offered help. "You're right," James said quietly. "We're not the same, but that doesn't mean we can't help each other out when help is needed. My father used to say that the measure of a community is how it treats those who have the least. Dusty Creek hasn't been measuring up well lately, and I'm trying to do my small part to change that." Clara felt her defensiveness waver. There was something genuine in his voice, something that reminded her of her own father in his better days, before the drinking and gambling had taken over. "I could use lamp oil," she admitted, "and thread, black thread if Henderson has any." I'll bring them by this afternoon." James put his hat back on, then paused. "Would it be all right if I stayed for a few minutes when I do, just to talk? Gets lonely out at the ranch sometimes, and I figure it might get lonely here too." Her first instinct was to say no, to maintain the walls she had built around herself for protection. But something in his hopeful expression made her reconsider. "I suppose a few minutes would be acceptable." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, warm and bright and impossible not to respond to. "I'll see you this afternoon then, Miss Hartwell. Clara," she said before she could stop herself. "If you're going to keep showing up at my door, you might as well call me Clara, Clara." He said her name like he was tasting something sweet. "I'll see you this afternoon, Clara." True to his word, James returned just after noon with a small can of lamp oil and 2 spools of black thread. He also brought a loaf of bread from the bakery and a jar of honey, which he claimed were extras that would just go to waste at the ranch. Clara suspected this was another kind lie, but she accepted them graciously, too hungry to let pride stand completely in her way. They sat on her porch steps, there being no room inside for 2 people to talk comfortably, and shared the bread with honey. James told her about the ranch, about the cattle and horses they raised, about his brother Thomas and sister-in-law Sarah and their new baby boy. He spoke about how hard the work was, but how satisfying it felt to build something with his own hands, to watch the calves grow strong and the land provide despite the harsh conditions. Clara found herself telling him about her mother's sewing, about the dresses and shirts and curtains that had come from Elizabeth Hartwell's skilled fingers. She talked about learning each stitch, about pricking her fingers bloody when she was young and how her mother would bandage them, and tell her that every seamstress bled for her craft at first. She didn't mention the hunger or the fear or the nights she lay awake wondering if she'd end up like some of the other desperate women in town, selling themselves just to survive. But James seemed to sense the things she didn't say, and his eyes held understanding rather than pity. "Your first shirt is finished," Clara said when the bread was gone and the honey jar scraped clean. "Let me show you." She brought it out and James examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. The torn shoulder seam was now invisible, reinforced so it would be stronger than before. The buttons were sewn on with perfect tension, and she had even taken the time to repair a small spot at the hem that he probably hadn't even noticed was damaged. "This is incredible work," James said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Better than it was when I bought it new." "That's what my mother always said, leave something better than you found it." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "She taught you well." James carefully folded the shirt and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You have a real gift, Clara. You shouldn't be hiding it away out here. You should have a shop in town, customers lined up at your door. That takes money I don't have, equipment, a location, a reputation that isn't just the poor dead seamstress's daughter who digs through trash." The bitterness crept back into her voice despite her best efforts. "Then we'll figure out a way to get you those things." James said it with such certainty, as if it were already decided. Clara raised an eyebrow, "if you'll let me help, as a friend." He held out his hand to her, palm up and offering. "I'd like to be your friend, Clara Hartwell, if you'll have me." Clara looked at his hand, calloused and strong, honest labor written in every line. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. "I'd like that too, James Sullivan." His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and sure, and something shifted in the space between them. Something that felt like the beginning of a story neither of them had planned to write, but both were suddenly eager to read. Over the following days, James found reasons to visit almost daily. Sometimes he brought supplies he claimed were extra. Sometimes he just stopped by to talk, to share a meal on her porch steps, to tell her stories about the ranch or listen to her memories of her parents. Clara finished all 3 of his shirts within the promised time, and he paid her double what she asked, insisting that the quality deserved it. With that money, Clara bought more fabric and thread and began taking in mending work from other people in town. James spread the word at the ranch and among his friends, and soon Clara had a steady trickle of customers. It wasn't enough to make her wealthy or even comfortable, but it was enough to buy food regularly, to begin saving a little, to feel like maybe she had a future after all. She made herself a new dress from the blue fabric James had brought, and the first time she wore it, his face lit up in a way that made her heart flutter strangely. He started staying longer during his visits, and she found herself looking forward to the sound of his horse approaching, to the knock on her door, to the easy conversation that flowed between them like water finding its course. One evening in late August, as they sat watching the sun set and paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, James took her hand again. This time it felt different, charged with intention. "Clara, I need to be honest with you about something," he said, his voice serious. Her stomach clenched with worry. "What is it?" "That first day when I saw you behind the general store, I didn't just happen to be walking by." He kept his eyes on the horizon as he spoke. "I'd been watching you for a while, trying to work up the courage to approach you. I knew who you were, knew what had happened with your father, and I knew you were too proud to accept help outright." Clara pulled her hand away, hurt blooming in her chest. "So you lied to me, about the shirts." The shirts needed mending, that part was true. "But I could have done it myself or let them go unrepaired. I used them as an excuse because I couldn't stand watching you suffer and doing nothing." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes pleading. "I'm sorry if that was wrong. I'm sorry if I hurt your pride. But I'm not sorry I helped you, and I'm not sorry I got to know you." Clara stood up, pacing the length of her small porch. Emotions warred within her: anger at being deceived, gratitude for the help, confusion about what she felt for this man who had inserted himself into her life. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the start? Would you have accepted help if I had?" James stood too, taking a step toward her. "Would you have even talked to me if I'd walked up and said I wanted to help you because I couldn't stop thinking about you?" "You couldn't stop thinking about me?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "No." He took another step closer, and now they were only a foot apart. "I've been thinking about you for months, Clara, since before your father died. I'd see you in town sometimes, walking with your head held high despite everything, and I'd think about how strong you must be, how brave. And then when things got worse for you, I wanted so badly to help but didn't know how without insulting you. I don't know what to say." Clara's voice shook slightly. "Say you'll forgive me for the small deception. Say you'll let me keep coming around, keep being your friend. Or maybe, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, say you'll let me court you properly." James reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I care about you, Clara, more than I probably should after such a short time, but I can't help it." Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. She thought about the past few weeks, about how much lighter her life had become with James in it. Not just because of the material help, though that had been crucial, but because of the companionship, the laughter, the sense that she wasn't facing the world alone anymore. She thought about the way her heart raced when she heard his horse approaching, the way she found herself smiling at odd moments when she remembered something he'd said, the way she had started to imagine a future that included him. "I feel it too," she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "It terrifies me, but I feel it too." James's smile was radiant. "Can I kiss you, Clara?" Instead of answering, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like they were both learning a new language. But then his arms came around her waist, pulling her closer, and she wrapped her hands around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of hunger and hope and the promise of something beautiful growing between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, James rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to do right by you, Clara Hartwell. I promise you that." "I believe you," she whispered, and realized with some surprise that she truly did. The courtship that followed was the talk of Dusty Creek, though not in the negative way Clara had feared. James was open about his affection for her, walking with her through town on Sunday afternoons, introducing her to his family, bringing her flowers from the wild prairie. Sarah Sullivan welcomed Clara with open arms, thrilled to have another woman in the family, and baby John seemed to take to Clara immediately, grabbing at her fingers with his tiny hands and gurgling contentedly when she held him. Thomas Sullivan, James's older brother, was more reserved but kind. He thanked Clara for finishing a shirt for the baby that their mother had started before she died 3 years prior. Clara hadn't known about the shirt, but James had quietly brought her the pieces, and she had completed it with painstaking care, trying to match Elizabeth Hartwell's stitches to the ones that James's mother had made. The result was a garment that represented two families coming together, two legacies of love and skill intertwining. As autumn arrived and the brutal summer heat gave way to cooler days, James began talking about the future more concretely. He wanted to build a house on a piece of land his father had left him, wanted to expand the ranch's operations, wanted to build something lasting. And in all his plans, Clara was present. "I'm not a wealthy man," James told her one October evening as they sat by a small fire he'd built near her shack. The nights were getting cold and he worried about her staying warm. "But I work hard and the ranch is doing well. I could provide for you, give you a real home. A workshop where you could sew with proper light and space. Maybe even help you open that shop in town eventually if that's what you want." Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching the flames dance. "I never thought I'd have this, someone who cares about my dreams as much as I do." "Your dreams are my dreams now," James said, kissing the top of her head. "That's what happens when you love someone. Love." The word hung in the air between them, enormous and fragile at once. Clara tilted her head back to look at him. "You love me, I do." There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his eyes. "I love you, Clara. I think I have since the first moment I saw you, though I didn't know it then. I love your strength and your skill and your determination. I love the way you refuse to give up even when everything seems impossible. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you concentrate when you're sewing and the fierce way you defend your pride." He cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me with your heart." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but for once they were happy tears, joyful tears. "I love you too, James. I think I've been falling in love with you since you lied about needing shirts mended," he laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Best lie I ever told. Ask me," Clara whispered. "Ask you what?" "You know what." James smiled, then shifted so he was kneeling in front of her, still holding her hands. "Clara Hartwell, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me build you a home and fill it with laughter and children and all the fabric and thread you could ever need? Would you let me love you for the rest of my days?" "Yes." The word came out choked with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." James pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she didn't care. She clung to him just as fiercely, feeling like after months of drowning, she had finally found solid ground. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the firelight, making plans and promises in hushed voices. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Dusty Creek. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored muslin, embroidered with blue thread in patterns her mother had taught her. Sarah Sullivan stood up with her, and Thomas stood with James. The preacher spoke about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage, but Clara barely heard the words. She was too focused on James, on the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, on the feel of his hand clasping hers as they said their vows. The wedding supper was held at the Sullivan Ranch, with neighbors and friends bringing dishes to share. There was music and dancing, and James spun Clara around until she was dizzy and laughing. People who had ignored her when she was destitute now congratulated her warmly, and while part of her resented their fickleness, the larger part simply chose to be happy. She had James now, and a new family, and a future that looked nothing like the bleak desperation she had known just months before. Their wedding night was spent in the small foreman's cabin on the ranch that would be their temporary home while James built their house. He carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the tradition, and then set her down gently in the middle of the one-room space that was sparse but clean. "It's not much," James said, suddenly sounding nervous. "But it's warm and dry and the bed is comfortable." Clara walked to him slowly, reaching up to cup his face. "It's perfect, you're perfect. This is all more than I ever dreamed of having." "You deserve so much more than this," James said softly, "but I promise I'll spend my life trying to give you everything you deserve. You already have." Clara kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into that kiss. James responded with gentle passion, lifting her into his arms and carrying her to the bed. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with reverence and joy. And afterwards, wrapped in each other's arms beneath a thick quilt, Clara felt a peace she had never known before. She was home. Finally, truly home. The winter that followed was harsh, with bitter winds and occasional snow that turned the desert landscape white and strange. But the cabin stayed warm, and Clara stayed busy with her sewing while James worked the ranch with his brother. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about the house James was planning, drawing rough sketches and arguing playfully about how many rooms they needed and where the windows should face. By the time spring arrived in 1883, construction on their house had begun. James and Thomas worked on it during any spare moment, and sometimes neighbors would come by to help raise walls or fit beams. Clara would bring lunch to the work site, marveling at how quickly the structure took shape. James had designed it with her in mind, including a large room with windows on two sides that would serve as her sewing room, with space for a proper work table and storage for fabrics and supplies. "You could take in more customers with a space like this," James said one day as they stood in the framed-out room, imagining how it would look when finished. "Maybe even hire someone to help you eventually." "I never thought I'd have my own shop," Clara said, running her hand along a window frame. "Even when my mother was alive, we rented our space. To own something outright, to have it be truly mine, ours." "Ours," James agreed, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Everything I have is yours now, Clara. That's what marriage means." Clara leaned back against him, closing her eyes and breathing in the scent of sawdust and spring air and the particular smell that was just James, soap and leather and sunshine. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly. She felt James go completely still behind her. Then he spun her around, his eyes wide and searching. "What did you say?" "I'm pregnant. About 3 months along, I think. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Clara bit her lip, suddenly nervous. They had talked about children in abstract terms, but the reality was different. "Are you happy about it?" "Happy." James let out a whoop of joy that startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. He picked Clara up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully, looking worried. "I'm sorry, should I not have done that? Is it bad for the baby?" "I don't know anything about pregnant women," Clara laughed, the sound bright and free. "I'm fine, we're fine, and I'm glad you're happy." "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it." James knelt down and placed his hands gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I'm your father, and I already love you more than I thought possible. You have the best mother in the world, and we're going to take such good care of you." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes again. She seemed to cry at the smallest things these days, though they were always happy tears now. "We need to finish the house before the baby comes." "We'll finish it," James promised, standing and kissing her softly. "I'll work day and night if I have to. Our child is going to be born in a real home, with a mother and father who love each other and will love them more than anything in this world." True to his word, James pushed hard to finish the house. By late summer, they were able to move in, though some of the interior work was still incomplete. Clara immediately set about making it a home, sewing curtains for every window, making quilts and pillows and tablecloths. Her sewing room became her sanctuary, and word of her skills spread beyond Dusty Creek to neighboring towns. She began receiving commissions for wedding dresses and christening gowns, for men's suits and women's day dresses. The money she earned was saved carefully, put away for the baby and for the future. Their daughter was born in November of 1883, during the first cold snap of the season. The birth was long and difficult, with Sarah Sullivan serving as midwife and James pacing holes in the floor of their living room. But when Clara finally held the tiny, red-faced baby girl in her arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. "She's perfect," Clara whispered, counting the baby's tiny fingers and toes. James sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his wife and daughter with an expression of absolute wonder. "What should we name her, Elizabeth?" Clara said without hesitation. "After my mother, Elizabeth Rose." "Elizabeth Rose Sullivan." James tested out the name. "It's beautiful, she's beautiful, you're beautiful." He kissed Clara's forehead gently. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." "I had good motivation," Clara said, smiling up at him. "I wanted to meet our daughter. Can I hold her?" James asked, his voice uncertain. Clara carefully transferred the baby to his arms, showing him how to support her head. James held Elizabeth with a gentleness that belied his size and strength, staring down at her with such naked love that Clara felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. "Hello, Elizabeth," James whispered. "I'm your papa, and I promise I'm going to do everything in my power to give you a good life. You'll never be hungry or cold or afraid. You'll never have to dig through trash or wonder if someone will help you. You'll be loved and cherished every single day of your life." Clara reached out and took James's hand, squeezing it gently. She thought about that day behind the general store, about how desperate and hopeless she had felt. She thought about the stranger who had approached her with kindness instead of judgment, who had found a way to help without hurting her pride, who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to love her anyway. "Thank you," she said softly. James looked up from the baby, confused. "For what?" "For buying that fabric, for lying about needing shirts mended, for giving me a chance when I had nothing, for loving me." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks again. "For all of it, for giving me this life, Clara." James's voice was thick with emotion. "You saved me just as much as I saved you. Before you, I was just going through the motions, working the ranch because it was expected, living a life that felt half empty. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to build something that matters. You gave me a family. You gave me everything." Baby Elizabeth chose that moment to let out a small cry, and both her parents laughed through their tears. The next hours passed in a blur of feeding and changing and learning how to care for this tiny person who had so completely captured their hearts. Sarah came in to check on them periodically, bringing food and clean cloths and words of encouragement. Thomas peeked in once, grinning at the sight of his younger brother cradling a baby. As night fell and Sarah finally left them alone, James lay down beside Clara on the bed, with Elizabeth sleeping in a cradle he had built himself right next to them. Clara rested her head on James's shoulder, exhausted but content. "This is just the beginning," James said quietly, staring at the ceiling. "We're going to fill this house with children and laughter. We're going to grow old together, watch our grandchildren play in these rooms. We're going to build a legacy." "We already have," Clara murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "We already have." The years that followed were full and rich, though not without challenges. The ranch went through difficult seasons, and there were times when money was tight and worry kept them both up at night. But they faced every challenge together, supporting each other through drought and disease, through the growing pains of raising children and running a business. Elizabeth was joined by a brother, Michael, in 1885, and another sister, Anna, in 1887. The house that had seemed so large when they first moved in began to feel crowded with the noise and chaos of 3 young children. Clara's sewing room became a place of refuge during the rare quiet moments, and her reputation as a seamstress continued to grow. She had customers from as far as 50 miles away, and she trained 2 young women from town in the craft, passing on her mother's teachings just as they had been passed to her. James expanded the ranch with his brother, adding more cattle and building new barns. The Sullivan Ranch became known throughout the territory for the quality of their livestock and the integrity of the men who ran it. On Sundays, the whole family would go to church together, and Clara would hold her head high, remembering the days when she had been too ashamed to show her face in town. One afternoon in the spring of 1890, Clara stood in her sewing room, working on a dress for Anna, when she heard the sound of children's laughter from outside. She walked to the window and saw James playing with all 3 children in the yard, chasing them in circles while they shrieked with delight. Elizabeth, now 6 years old, was the ringleader, directing her siblings in their attempts to evade their father. Michael, at 5, was determined to tackle James's legs, while little Anna, just 3, toddled after them, all with her arms outstretched. Clara watched her family with a heart so full it ached. She thought about that girl behind the general store 7 years ago, picking through trash with trembling hands and an empty stomach. She thought about the scrap of calico that had seemed like a treasure and the bolt of blue fabric that had been a lifeline. She thought about how a single act of kindness from a stranger had changed the entire trajectory of her life. The door to her sewing room opened and James came in, slightly out of breath from playing. The children finally wore themselves out, Sarah's watching them for a bit. "You're good with them," Clara said, turning from the window. "I learned from the best." James came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about? The past, the future, how much things have changed?" Clara covered his hands with hers. "How grateful I am." "I'm the grateful one," James said, kissing her neck softly. "Every single day I wake up and can't believe I get to live this life with you." Clara turned in his arms to face him. The years had been kind to James. There was more sun weathering on his face now, a few silver threads in his dark hair, but his eyes still held that same storm water color, still looked at her with the same love and devotion they had shown that first day behind the general store. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Clara asked. "If you just walked past and minded your own business?" James considered the question seriously. "I think I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. I think I would have always wondered what might have been if I'd been brave enough to speak to you." He touched her face gently. "But I didn't walk past, I stopped, and everything else followed from that one decision." "The best decision," Clara said. "The best decision," James agreed. They stood together in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, holding each other in the room where Clara created beautiful things from simple cloth. Outside, their children played. Around them, the house they had built together stood strong. And between them, the love that had grown from a moment of desperation and compassion continued to deepen and strengthen with each passing day. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, James and Clara sat on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Clara had brought out her sewing, working on mending one of Michael's shirts by lamplight, while James whittled a small toy horse for Anna. "I've been thinking," James said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Thomas is talking about retiring from the ranch in a few years. He wants to spend more time with Sarah and the grandchildren." "Grandchildren? John's only 7, Clara said, amused. "You know Thomas. He plans everything years in advance." James set down his whittling. "He wants to sell me his half of the ranch at a fair price. It would mean more work, more responsibility, but also more profit. We could really set ourselves up well, leave something substantial for the children." Clara set down her sewing and looked at her husband. "What do you want to do?" "I want to build something that lasts. I want our children to have opportunities we didn't have. I want Elizabeth to be able to open her own shop someday if she wants, or go to a fancy school back east. I want Michael and Anna to have choices." James reached for her hand. "But I won't do it if it means sacrificing time with you and the children. You're more important than any amount of money or land." "I think we can do both," Clara said thoughtfully. "You could hire on more hands, train someone to manage the day-to-day operations. You're good at working with people, James. You could oversee things without having to do every piece of physical labor yourself. That's actually a good idea. James looked surprised. Why didn't I think of that? Because you're used to doing everything yourself. But we're not alone anymore, neither of us. We have family, friends, people we can trust and rely on. Clara squeezed his hand. And I'm doing well with the sewing. I've saved almost $200 over the past few years. We could use that to help with the purchase if needed. Clara, that's your money. You earned it. It's our money. We're partners, remember? She smiled at him. Everything you have is mine and everything I have is yours. That's what you told me once. James pulled her close, kissing her with the easy affection of long familiarity mixed with the passion that still sparked between them. How did I get so lucky? You lied about needing shirts mended, Clara teased. And then you left fabric on my step like some kind of fairy godfather. I left it on your step because you wouldn't have taken it from my hands, James protested, laughing. True, Clara rested her head on his shoulder. But it worked. You got my attention, you earned my trust, you won my heart. Best investment I ever made, James said softly. They sat together under the stars, making plans and dreaming dreams, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. The scrap-picking girl and the cowboy who couldn't walk past her suffering had become partners in every sense of the word, building a life neither had thought possible but both had secretly longed for. The years continued to unfold, bringing both joys and sorrows. James and Clara lost a fourth baby, a son, when Clara was 6 months pregnant in 1892. The grief was devastating, and for a while, Clara wondered if she would ever feel whole again. But James held her through the darkest nights, and their 3 living children needed their mother, and slowly, painfully, Clara healed. She made a small quilt for the baby they had lost and kept it in her sewing room, a memorial to the child who had never drawn breath but had been loved nonetheless. In 1894, a fire swept through part of Dusty Creek, destroying several buildings including Henderson's general store. The community came together to rebuild, and Clara organized the women to make clothing and blankets for those who had lost everything. She remembered too well what it felt like to have nothing, and she gave generously of both her time and resources. James was equally generous, donating lumber and labor to the rebuilding efforts. Elizabeth grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's skill for sewing and her father's head for business. At 16, she began seriously talking about opening her own dress shop, and Clara and James encouraged her ambitions. Michael showed an aptitude for working with horses and spent every spare moment at the ranch, learning from his father and uncle. Anna, the baby, was proving to be the wild one, climbing trees and refusing to wear dresses if she could help it, much to everyone's amusement. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, James surprised Clara by taking her back to the spot where they had first met behind what was now the rebuilt general store. He had arranged for Sarah to watch the children for the afternoon, and he led Clara through town to the alley, holding her hand the whole way. "Why are we here?" Clara asked, confused. "Because this is where it all started," James said. He pointed to the exact spot where he had found her picking through trash. "Right there, that's where I saw you and knew I had to do something." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I was so ashamed that day, so desperate, I know. And I was so scared you'd refuse my help, that you'd tell me to leave you alone and I'd never get a chance to know you." James pulled her close. "But you didn't. You let me help, even though it was hard for you. And that bravery, that willingness to accept kindness even when you were at your lowest, that's what made me fall in love with you." "I thought it was my sewing skills," Clara joked weakly, wiping at her eyes. "That too," James smiled. "But mostly it was you, your strength, your dignity. The way you refused to let circumstances destroy who you were." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I got you something." Clara unwrapped it carefully to find a length of the finest silk she had ever seen, deep crimson with gold threads woven through it. It must have cost a fortune. James, this is too much. Nothing is too much for you. Make yourself something beautiful with it. Make yourself a dress fit for a queen, because that's what you are to me. James kissed her softly. My queen, my love, my everything. Clara threw her arms around him, holding him tight, the precious silk clutched between them. I love you so much. I love you too, James murmured into her hair, forever and always. They stood in that alley, the place where desperation had met compassion, where a cowboy had seen a woman in need and chosen to help, where a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that sustained them both. And Clara thought that if she could go back and tell that desperate, frightened girl picking through trash that everything would be all right, that she would find love and happiness and a full life beyond her wildest dreams, she wasn't sure that girl would have believed her. But it was true. All of it was true. As the 20th century approached, the Sullivan family continued to thrive. James and Thomas successfully purchased and managed the expanded ranch, hiring good workers and building a reputation that stretched beyond the Arizona territory. Clara's sewing business became legendary, and mothers began bringing their daughters to learn from her, wanting them to have a trade and skill that could support them if needed. Elizabeth opened her dress shop in Dusty Creek in 1899, with financial backing from her parents and a determination that reminded everyone of Clara. The grand opening was attended by half the town, and Clara stood in the back of the shop, watching her daughter interact with customers, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had given her daughter something she herself hadn't had, the opportunity to build her dream from a position of security rather than desperation. Michael married the daughter of a neighboring rancher in 1901, and James cried openly at the wedding, overwhelmed with joy at seeing his son so happy. Anna shocked everyone by announcing at 17 that she wanted to be a teacher, and with her parents' support, she went to school in Tucson and returned 2 years later to teach at the Dusty Creek Schoolhouse. On a warm evening in the spring of 1903, 21 years after that fateful day behind the general store, Clara and James sat on their porch once again. Their hair was graying now, and their faces showed the lines and wrinkles of a life well lived. But they still held hands, still found comfort in each other's presence, still loved each other with the same intensity as those early days, tempered now by decades of partnership and shared experience. We did all right, didn't we? James said, watching the sunset paint the sky. We did better than all right, Clara said. We built something real, something lasting. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? James asked. If I hadn't stopped that day, if you'd been too proud to accept help, if any number of small things had gone differently. Sometimes, Clara admitted. But then I think about how everything that happened, good and bad, led us to this moment, to this life, and I wouldn't change a thing. James raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. Not even the hard parts, not even those, they made us who we are. They taught us what matters. Clara looked at their joined hands, at the matching silver bands they wore, at the calluses and scars that told the story of their years together. You saved me, James. But more than that, you loved me when I had nothing to offer you but myself. That's the real gift you gave me. You had everything to offer, James said firmly. Your strength, your skill, your courage, your heart. You've made me the luckiest man alive, Clara Sullivan. And you've made me the happiest woman in the Arizona territory, Clara said, smiling at him with all the love of 21 years together. As full darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one, they remained on their porch, wrapped in each other's arms and the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. Inside their house, the house James had built with his own hands, were memories of children growing up and holidays celebrated and ordinary moments that had accumulated into an extraordinary life. In Clara's sewing room, the deep blue fabric that had started everything was long gone, transformed into the dress she had worn to her wedding. But the cream muslin remained, kept in her mother's trunk as a reminder of the day her life had changed forever. Sometimes she would take it out and hold it, remembering the girl she had been and the woman she had become. Years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren, bringing changes to Dusty Creek as the wild frontier slowly gave way to settled civilization. The Sullivan Ranch remained a cornerstone of the community, and Clara's sewing techniques were passed down through generations of women who learned at her knee. In the spring of 1925, 43 years after James had found Clara behind the general store, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The celebration was held at the ranch, with family and friends coming from across the state. Elizabeth, now a successful businesswoman with grown children of her own, organized the entire event. Michael, who had taken over running the ranch when James retired, ensured that everything was perfect. Anna, still teaching at the schoolhouse at 41, wrote a beautiful speech about her parents' love story that left hardly a dry eye in the audience. Clara, now 72 years old, wore a dress she had sewn herself from silver silk that Elizabeth had imported from San Francisco. James, at 75, wore his finest suit and looked at his wife with the same love and wonder he had shown on their wedding day. They danced together slowly, carefully, their movements limited by age but their connection as strong as ever. 50 years, Clara said softly as they swayed to the music. Half a century. Best 50 years of my life, James said. Though I do wish my knees worked better so I could spin you around like I used to. Clara laughed, the sound a little breathier than it once was but still full of joy. We've earned our aches and pains. We've lived a full life, James. A good life. The best life, James agreed. Because I lived it with you. They stayed on the dance floor until the song ended, then made their way to chairs that had been set up for them. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren swarmed around them, full of questions and stories and love. Clara looked at the faces of her descendants, at the proof of the life she and James had built together, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Later, when the party had wound down and they were alone in the house that had sheltered them for over 40 years, James and Clara prepared for bed with the familiar routine of decades. Clara sat at her vanity, brushing out her long silver hair, while James removed his suit and hung it carefully in the wardrobe. Clara, James said from behind her. Yes, love. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy who lied about needing shirts mended. His voice was thick with emotion. Clara turned to face him, seeing the tears on his weathered cheeks. She stood and went to him, taking his face in her hands. Thank you for buying that fabric. Thank you for leaving it on my step. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. Thank you for loving me. They held each other in the middle of their bedroom, two people who had started with nothing but hope and built an empire of love. Outside, the Arizona night was filled with stars, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their first home, their first child, every milestone and moment of their long journey together. I'd do it all again, James whispered. Every single moment. I'd find you behind that general store, and I'd lie about those shirts, and I'd buy that fabric, and I'd court you and marry you and build this life with you all over again. So would I, Clara said, tears streaming down her face. 1,000 times over I'd choose you. They stood together, hearts beating in rhythm, two lives so thoroughly intertwined that neither could remember what it felt like to be separate. The scrap-picking girl had become a matriarch. The helpful cowboy had become a patriarch. Together, they had built not just a family but a legacy of love and kindness, and the belief that one person reaching out to another could change everything. Their love story had started with desperation and fabric, with need meeting compassion. It had grown through years of partnership and challenge and joy, and it would continue through the children they had raised and the values they had instilled, long after both of them had passed from this world into whatever waited beyond. But that was still years away. For now, Clara and James Sullivan climbed into bed together, as they had done for 50 years, and wrapped themselves in each other's arms. They fell asleep to the sound of each other's breathing, content in the knowledge that they had been blessed beyond measure, that they had found in each other everything they had ever needed. The fabric James had bought and left on Clara's step had been transformed into more than just a dress. It had been transformed into a life, a family, a love that would endure long after the cloth itself had turned to dust. And in the end, that was the real magic. Not the fabric itself, but what it represented, the bridge it had built between two lonely hearts that were meant to find each other. In the wild west town of Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory, in the year 1882, a cowboy had seen a woman picking through trash for scraps of cloth and had made a choice. He had chosen compassion over indifference, action over apathy, love over loneliness. And that choice had echoed through decades, creating ripples that spread far beyond what either of them could have imagined. It was a story they told their grandchildren, a story that became family legend, a story that reminded everyone who heard it that kindness matters, that love is possible even in the darkest moments, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest acts of human decency. Clara and James Sullivan lived out the remainder of their days in that house on the Sullivan Ranch, surrounded by family and love, secure in the knowledge that their life together had been exactly what it was meant to be. A testament to the power of love, the importance of compassion, and the truth that even the smallest gesture can change everything when it comes from a genuine heart. And every time Clara saw fabric, any fabric, she remembered. She remembered the hunger and the desperation, the shame and the fear. But more than that, she remembered the sound of boots on dirt, a voice asking a question, storm-colored eyes looking at her with kindness instead of judgment. She remembered the weight of new fabric in her hands, the color of evening sky, the softness of muslin. She remembered falling in love with a man who had seen her at her worst and chosen to see her at her best. That was the story. That was their story, and it was beautiful.